Normandy, June 1944. A single German sniper had pinned down an entire British platoon for 3 days, killing 17 men. Officers attempted every tactical solution: smoke grenades, suppressive fire, flanking maneuvers. Yet the invisible killer remained untouchable. Then Private Thomas Hendricks, a 22-year-old dock worker from Liverpool, proposed something so absurd his sergeant nearly had him disciplined: a child's slingshot and a tin can. The morning of June 9th, 1944, arrived with the acrid smell of cordite and wet earth, saturating the French countryside 3 miles inland from Sword Beach. At precisely 5:47 hours, the temperature registered 14 degrees Celsius, unseasonably cold for June, with persistent drizzle transforming the churned soil around the ruined village of Breville into glutinous mud that clung to boots and equipment. The 2nd Battalion, Royal Warwickshire Regiment, had fought their way 7 miles inland over 4 brutal days, losing 43 men to German resistance that refused to collapse despite Allied numerical superiority. Now they faced something worse than organized resistance: a single marksman who had transformed military advance into massacre. The sniper's position remained unknown despite 3 days of reconnaissance. He operated from somewhere within the skeletal remains of a manor house on elevated ground overlooking the only viable approach route. 17 British soldiers had died attempting to advance, clean shots through the head or upper chest, each kill demonstrating professional marksmanship that transcended ordinary infantry capability. Another 23 men had suffered wounds requiring evacuation. The entire offensive had stalled because one German rifleman controlled a 50-meter corridor of absolutely lethal ground. The strategic mathematics were brutal. British forces needed to advance through this corridor to reach the crossroads that controlled supply routes to 3 surrounding villages. German forces elsewhere were collapsing, but this single position held because the sniper made forward movement mathematically impossible. Officers calculated that even with smoke cover and suppressive fire, they would lose another dozen men minimum before reaching the manor house. High Command refused to authorize artillery strikes that would destroy the only bridge capable of supporting armor. They were trapped by a problem that conventional military doctrine could not solve. Captain Michael Strafford, aged 37, from Kent, a solicitor before the war, had exhausted every tactical option. He had ordered smoke grenades. The sniper simply waited until wind dispersed the cover and resumed killing. He had attempted night infiltration. The German apparently possessed equipment enabling him to see in near-total darkness. He had organized coordinated suppressive fire from 8 different angles simultaneously. The sniper had gone silent for precisely 12 minutes, then killed the first man who moved. The corpses of British soldiers sprawled across open ground because recovering bodies meant exposing recovery teams to certain death. Private Thomas Hendricks sat in a muddy trench 20 meters from the killing ground, his Lee Enfield rifle clean despite 3 days of constant rain. Dock workers understood maintaining tools meant survival. He was short, 5 feet 7 inches, built compact and powerful from years hauling cargo in Liverpool's King's Dock. His hands bore scars from rope burns and crushed fingers. His accent marked him as working-class Merseyside, thick enough that officers occasionally requested he repeat statements. He had joined the army in 1942 when German bombing destroyed the warehouse where he worked, killing his supervisor and 7 colleagues. For 3 days, Hendricks had observed the killing ground with methodical attention that came from years of dock work where inattention meant crushed limbs or death. He noted the trajectory angles of bullets striking British soldiers. He observed how the sniper never fired more than once per minute, suggesting bolt-action rifle requiring manual cycling. He watched how shots arrived during moments of maximum British exposure, climbing over obstacles, moving between cover points, turning heads to call orders. This was not indiscriminate fire, but calculated killing that demonstrated profound understanding of human movement patterns. What troubled Hendricks was not the sniper's skill, but the mathematical impossibility of locating him. The manor house offered perhaps 40 potential firing positions: windows, roof gaps, cellar openings, collapsed wall sections. British reconnaissance had identified 23 separate positions, offering adequate sightlines to the killing ground. Yet the sniper fired from somewhere none of their reconnaissance had identified, which meant he either moved constantly between positions or occupied a location British tactical doctrine had failed to consider. On the evening of June 11th, following the death of Corporal Davies, a Welshman with 3 children who had made the mistake of raising his head 15 centimetres above trench level, Captain Strafford called for volunteers for a frontal assault scheduled for dawn. The tactical situation had become untenable. They could not advance, could not retreat without abandoning strategic objectives, could not remain static because German reinforcements were reportedly moving toward their position. High Command demanded they clear the corridor within 24 hours, regardless of casualties. Hendricks did not volunteer for the assault. Instead, he approached Captain Strafford with a proposal so apparently ridiculous that the captain's first response was incredulous laughter, followed by genuine anger. "Private, are you suffering shell shock? Have you completely lost your faculties?" But Hendricks persisted with the stubborn determination of a Liverpool dock worker who understood that stupid-sounding solutions sometimes solved impossible problems. He had worked Liverpool docks for 8 years before conscription, where improvisation meant the difference between completed work and financial ruin. He had seen dock workers solve engineering problems that defeated university-trained engineers, because practical men understood that elegant solutions often emerged from accepting reality rather than imposing doctrine. His proposal: fashion a slingshot from rubber inner tubing salvaged from damaged vehicles, use it to launch objects toward the sniper's suspected position, and observe where fire originated from when the sniper reacted. Captain Strafford initially refused, calling it playground nonsense inappropriate for military operations. But as midnight approached and dawn assault drew nearer, the captain's resistance weakened. They had no other options. Conventional tactics had failed 17 times. Men were going to die at dawn regardless. Perhaps stupidity was precisely what this situation required. The construction phase began at 01:30 hours on June 12th, under conditions that would have made civilian project management impossible. Hendricks worked in a trench, illuminated only by shielded torches, rain falling steadily, temperature dropping to 11 degrees, fingers numb from cold and wet. His materials consisted entirely of salvaged rubbish: rubber inner tubing from a destroyed motorcycle, leather strips cut from a dead soldier's boot, wood from a shattered rifle stock, and wire scavenged from communication equipment. These were not precision components, but desperate improvisations assembled by a man who had spent his adult life making broken things work. The fundamental challenge was tensile strength. Slingshots function through elastic potential energy, stretching rubber stores energy released when tension releases, converting stored potential into kinetic energy that propels projectiles. Hendricks needed sufficient power to launch objects 150 meters toward the manor house, while maintaining accuracy adequate to strike specific windows or wall sections. Motorcycle inner tubing possessed excellent elasticity, but degraded rapidly when cut and exposed to environmental stress. The material had been sitting in rain and mud for 4 days, compromising its structural integrity. Hendricks' solution demonstrated the practical engineering knowledge that came from dock work rather than formal education. He braided 3 separate tubes together, increasing cross-sectional thickness and distributing stress across multiple failure points. When one tube developed micro-tears from environmental exposure, the remaining tubes maintained structural integrity. He bound the tubes at regular intervals using wire, preventing individual tubes from sliding and ensuring load distribution remained even. The leather pouch came from the boot of Private Collins, killed 2 days earlier. Hendricks offered silent apology while cutting the leather, promising Collins his death would mean something. The frame required different considerations. Wood needed to withstand repeated stress cycles without splintering or developing structural failures that would cause catastrophic breakage during launch. Rifle stocks were designed for this purpose, crafted from hardwoods selected specifically for durability under repeated mechanical stress. Hendricks selected fragments from a Lee Enfield destroyed by German mortar fire, cutting pieces approximately 30 centimeters long, removing splinters, creating a Y-shaped frame that distributed tension forces across natural grain patterns. Assembly occurred while German artillery conducted periodic harassing fire, shells exploding 200 meters distant, close enough that Hendricks felt concussive pressure through the ground. He worked methodically, testing each connection point, ensuring wire bindings were tight, checking that rubber tubes maintained consistent tension across their length. Other soldiers watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt. Sergeant Williams, a regular army man from Manchester with 12 years' service, openly called it the stupidest fucking thing I've seen since France fell. But Captain Strafford had authorized it, which meant soldiers remained silent about their opinions. The operational challenge extended beyond construction to ammunition selection. Hendricks needed projectiles that would be visible in flight, allowing observers to track trajectory and identify impact points, while also being sufficiently provocative that the German sniper would reveal his position by firing at the disturbance. Rocks were too irregular for consistent flight patterns. Spent shell casings were too light for accurate trajectory. Hendricks settled on tin cans partially filled with mud. The cans provided consistent aerodynamic profile, the mud added mass ensuring adequate flight distance, and the bright metal would be visible against grey sky and dark stone. Testing the device was impossible without revealing their position to the sniper. Hendricks estimated trajectories based on rubber tension and projectile mass, using mental mathematics, learned from years calculating cargo weights and crane capacities. He calculated that pulling rubber tubes back 60 centimeters would generate sufficient force to launch a mud-filled tin can approximately 150 meters at an arc, reaching 20 meters maximum altitude. These were approximations, not precision engineering, but approximations were what dockworkers had instead of degrees. By OLO 400 hours, the weapon was complete. It looked exactly as absurd as it functioned. A child's toy constructed from rubbish by a desperate man with no better options. Captain Strafford examined it with an expression mixing resignation and faint hope. Private Hendricks, this is either brilliantly unconventional or catastrophically stupid. We'll know within minutes. Morzin, the plan was simple. Hendricks would launch cans toward different sections of the manor house, while observers with binoculars watched for muzzle flash or movement when the sniper reacted. If they could identify his exact position, marksmen could suppress him long enough for an assault team to advance. The psychological pressure was extraordinary. 17 men had died because this problem remained unsolved. Another dozen would likely die at dawn if Hendricks's plan failed. He could feel their deaths accumulating like physical weight. But Hendricks understood something about improvisation that officers trained at Sandhurst did not. Sometimes the stupidest possible solution was stupid precisely because it circumvented assumptions that made conventional solutions fail. The German sniper expected suppressive fire, smoke grenades, coordinated assaults, artillery preparation, all the tactical responses that British military doctrine prescribed. He did not expect a Liverpool dockworker with a slingshot, because military doctrine did not include slingshots. At 04:30 hours, as dawn approached and rain intensified into a steady downpour that reduced visibility to perhaps 80 meters, Hendricks prepared for the operation that would either solve an impossible problem or confirm that impossibility was indeed impossible. His hands were steady, despite cold and fatigue. He had loaded 6 tin cans with varying amounts of mud, calculating different trajectories for different manor house sections. Captain Strafford had positioned 8 observers with binoculars at different angles, each responsible for monitoring specific windows or wall sections. Sergeant Williams had organized a marksman team ready to deliver suppressive fire the moment they identified the sniper's location. The order came at 04:45 hours. Private Hendricks, proceed with operation. He lifted the slingshot, placed the first can in the leather pouch, pulled back rubber tubing until tension reached maximum safe extension, aimed toward the manor house's eastern wing, and released. The first tin can arced through grey morning air, with the distinctive tumbling flight pattern of an aerodynamically imperfect object, visible despite rain and poor light, because morning twilight provided just enough illumination to silhouette bright metal against dark stone. Hendricks watched its trajectory with professional attention, noting how wind from the northeast pushed the can approximately 2 meters left of intended impact point. The can struck the manor house's eastern wall with a metallic clatter, audible across the killing ground, sharp, discordant, completely unlike any sound associated with normal combat operations. For exactly 4 seconds, nothing happened. Then a single rifle shot cracked across the distance, the sound arriving fractionally after the muzzle flash, a yellow-orange spark lasting perhaps 1/10 of a second, visible from a position observers had not previously considered. A collapsed section of the manor house's main chimney stack, approximately 15 meters above ground level. The sniper had been firing from a position offering complete visibility of the killing ground, while remaining invisible to British reconnaissance, because British tactical doctrine assumed snipers operated from ground level or first-floor positions, where they could retreat quickly if discovered. Corporal Jenkins, a Yorkshireman with binoculars positioned in a forward observation post, shouted immediately, "Chimney stack, eastern side, 15 meters up. I saw the flash." Every observer swiveled toward the position. The chimney stack's exterior was damaged, but structurally intact, offering a small opening where stones had collapsed, creating a natural firing port approximately 30 centimeters wide. The position was brilliant, elevated enough to provide commanding sight lines, obscured enough that casual observation would miss it, stable enough for precision shooting, and protected enough that suppressive fire would be largely ineffective because the small opening limited target area. Captain Strafford's response was immediate. "Marksman, suppressive fire on that position. Do not let him fire again." 8 Lee Enfield rifles opened fire simultaneously, bullets striking stone around the chimney opening, creating chips and dust clouds, but unlikely to penetrate deep enough to reach the sniper if he had retreated into the chimney's interior. The suppressive fire would not kill him, but would prevent him from firing during the critical window when British forces needed to advance. But the German sniper made a mistake born from 3 days of absolute dominance. He had killed 17 British soldiers without receiving meaningful counterfire. He had operated with impunity that created psychological confidence bordering on arrogance. When the tin can struck the wall, an object so bizarre and unexpected that it registered as potential threat requiring investigation, his trained response was to fire at the disturbance, eliminating potential danger before understanding what that danger represented. This instantaneous response, drilled through years of sniper training, emphasizing immediate threat elimination, meant he exposed his position for that fraction of a second necessary for Corporal Jenkins to identify his location. Hendricks did not wait for orders. He loaded the second tin can, adjusted his aim based on observed wind drift from the first shot, targeted the chimney stack directly, pulled back rubber tubing, and released. The can flew straight toward the position, struck stone directly below the firing port with another metallic clatter, and this time the Germans' response revealed more than just position. It revealed frustration. The sniper fired twice in rapid succession, bullets striking the killing ground nowhere near British positions, simply shooting at the absurd objects disturbing his operational space. That was the moment German tactical discipline completely collapsed. Snipers were trained to maintain position discipline absolutely, never firing except at confirmed targets, never revealing location through unnecessary shots, never allowing emotion to override tactical calculation. But the tin cans represented something the snipers' training had not covered. Harassment by objects that posed no threat but created psychological disturbance that undermined operational composure. It was the military equivalent of someone repeatedly ringing a doorbell and running away, tactically meaningless but psychologically infuriating. Captain Strafford recognized the opportunity instantly. "Assault team, prepare to advance on my command. Marksman, maintain suppressive fire." The assault team consisted of 12 men, who had volunteered knowing they were likely to die. Now they crouched at the trench line, waiting for the moment when suppressive fire would make advance survivable. Hendricks loaded the third can, while British rifles continued hammering the chimney stack, creating enough noise and stone fragmentation that the German sniper would need extraordinary courage to expose himself for another shot. But British officers had not anticipated what happened next. Private Hendricks, with the methodical precision of a man who had spent 8 years calculating trajectories for crane loads, had noticed something during those 2 launches. The chimney stack's opening was approximately 30 centimeters wide and perhaps 40 centimeters tall based on visual estimate. The third tin can was slightly smaller than average, measuring approximately 8 centimeters in diameter. If trajectory calculation was precise, if wind conditions remained stable, if rubber tension remained consistent, there existed a non-zero probability that he could launch the can directly through the firing port into the chimney stack's interior, where the sniper was positioned. The mathematical probability was perhaps 5%. Trajectory calculation involved too many variables. Aerodynamic unpredictability of tumbling cans made precision impossible, and distance meant small errors would magnify into complete misses. But 5% probability was 5% more than zero, and zero was what conventional tactics had achieved. Hendricks adjusted his stance, compensated for wind, elevated aim angle by approximately 2 degrees, pulled rubber tension to absolute maximum extension without risking structural failure, and released. The third can flew with trajectory that seemed impossibly precise. It arced upward through rain and morning twilight, reached maximum altitude approximately 12 meters above ground, descended toward the chimney stack, approached the firing port opening while tumbling slightly, and, through combination of calculation, compensation, and sheer statistical probability, passed directly through the opening into the chimney interior. The metallic clang of impact echoed differently this time, not stone but metal, the sound of tin striking what was likely the German sniper's rifle or helmet. For exactly 2 seconds, absolute silence reigned across the battlefield, except for rain falling on churned earth. Then a human scream erupted from the chimney stack, startled, pained, absolutely genuine. The German sniper, struck by an 8-centimeter tin can, traveling at perhaps 40 kilometers per hour, had been injured by the most absurd weapon deployed in Normandy campaign. The scream continued for approximately 5 seconds before cutting off sharply, replaced by sounds of scrambling movement inside the chimney structure. Captain Strafford stood motionless, his expression suggesting complete inability to process what had just occurred. Then his military training reasserted itself. "Assault team, advance immediately! Marksman, maintain fire! Move now, while he's disoriented!" The 12-man assault team erupted from the trench and sprinted across the killing ground that had been absolutely lethal for 3 days. Not a single shot challenged them. They reached the manor house foundation in 23 seconds, took cover, and began clearing the structure room by room. The chimney stack was accessed from the manor house's 2nd floor via a maintenance ladder leading into the flue system. When British soldiers finally reached the position 40 minutes later, they found it empty except for abandoned equipment. A Carabiner 98K rifle with Zeiss scope, 57 rounds of ammunition, blankets, water canteen, and dried rations sufficient for a week. The German sniper had fled through a concealed exit in the chimney's base, escaping into the countryside. But he had also left behind something more valuable than his physical presence: the psychological dominance that had paralyzed British advance for 3 days. The crossroads beyond Breville was secured by 0800 hours on June 12, 1944, exactly 17 hours ahead of High Command's revised schedule. British forces advanced 3 miles that day, encountering German resistance that collapsed with unexpected speed because word had spread through Wehrmacht radio communications that British forces were deploying unconventional weapons of unprecedented nature. German intelligence officers spent considerable resources attempting to identify what new technology the British had developed, never discovering that the weapon in question was rubber tubing and tin cans operated by a Liverpool dock worker. The strategic impact of that single morning extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The crossroads that Private Hendricks's Slingshot had unlocked controlled supply routes supporting 3 surrounding villages, and the only bridge capable of supporting armored vehicles within 8 kilometers. Securing these positions 3 days earlier than projected meant British armoured divisions reached their next objective, the town of Ranville, with sufficient time to establish defensive positions before German counterattack arrived. That defensive success contributed directly to holding the eastern flank of the Normandy beachhead during the critical first 2 weeks when German forces attempted to drive Allied troops back into the sea. The operational statistics were precisely documented in 2nd Battalion's after-action reports. 17 British soldiers died during the 3-day stalemate, 23 were wounded seriously enough to require evacuation, and tactical advance had stalled completely. Following Hendrick's intervention, the battalion suffered 2 additional casualties during the Manor House assault, both men recovering fully within 6 weeks, and 0 casualties from sniper fire. The mathematical difference was stark. Hendrick's improvised solution had prevented what High Command estimated would have been 12 to 15 additional deaths during the planned frontal assault. Private Thomas Hendricks received no immediate recognition for his actions because British military doctrine in 1944 did not include formal commendation categories for improvised weapons deployed contrary to regulations. His after-action interview was brief and uncomfortable, with Captain Strafford struggling to document how a slingshot had solved a problem that conventional tactics could not address. The official report described the event as unorthodox reconnaissance technique, yielding actionable intelligence regarding enemy position, making no mention of rubber tubing or tin cans because doing so would have made the report sound like fabrication or evidence of command incompetence. Hendricks himself returned to his position in the battalion with the same quiet determination that had characterized his approach throughout the war. He continued serving through the Normandy campaign, fighting across France into Belgium, surviving the Ardennes counter-offensive, and eventually reaching Germany by March 1945. He was wounded twice, shrapnel wounds to his left shoulder and right leg, but recovered both times and returned to active duty. His Lee Enfield remained meticulously maintained, his equipment clean and functional, his behavior consistent with a man who understood that survival required treating tools with respect. The war ended on May 8, 1945. Hendricks was demobilized on August 3, 1945, returning to Liverpool with £42 in discharge pay, a set of civilian clothes that fit poorly, and psychological scars that manifested as nightmares and sudden startle responses that would persist for decades. Liverpool's docks had been heavily damaged by German bombing during the war, but reconstruction was underway and dock workers were desperately needed. Hendricks returned to his previous employer and spent the next 37 years loading and unloading cargo, operating cranes, supervising dock operations, and eventually retiring in 1982 at age 60 with a modest pension. He married in 1947 to Margaret O'Connor, an Irish woman who had worked in munitions factory during the war. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, and 7 grandchildren. He rarely spoke about the war, except in vague generalities, a pattern common among combat veterans who found that civilian life provided no context for understanding battlefield experience. His family knew he had served in Normandy and had been wounded, but knew almost nothing about specific events. The Slingshot incident was never mentioned in family conversations because Hendricks himself considered it an embarrassing improvisation rather than something worth commemorating. Recognition came decades later through accident rather than design. In 1983, a military historian named Dr. Edward Chambers was researching unconventional weapons development during World War II for a book examining innovation under combat conditions. While reviewing 2nd Battalion's after-action reports from Normandy, he discovered Captain Strafford's deliberately vague description of unorthodox reconnaissance technique and became curious about what that phrase concealed. Further research in battalion records revealed Corporal Jenkins' more detailed observer report, which explicitly described a slingshot and tin cans. Chambers initially assumed this was clerical error or combat fatigue-induced hallucination, but cross-referencing multiple witness statements confirmed the events had occurred exactly as described. Dr. Chambers tracked down Thomas Hendricks, now aged 61 and retired, living in a small house in Liverpool's Walton district. The interview occurred in Hendricks's kitchen over tea, with Hendricks demonstrating profound discomfort about discussing events he considered personally embarrassing. His exact words, recorded in Dr. Chambers' notes, were, "It was the stupidest thing I ever did in the war. I'm amazed the captain didn't have me court-martialed for wasting time with children's toys while men were dying. But it worked, didn't it? Sometimes stupid works when clever doesn't." The formal recognition came in 1987 when the Ministry of Defense, prompted by Dr. Chambers' research and advocacy, awarded Thomas Hendricks a mention in dispatches, a formal commendation recognizing gallant or meritorious service. The ceremony was small and private, held at Liverpool's Town Hall, attended by Hendricks' family, several veterans from his battalion, and Dr. Chambers. Hendricks, aged 65 and suffering from emphysema that would kill him 4 years later, accepted the commendation with characteristic modesty. "I did what dock workers do. I solved a problem with whatever tools I had available. The army had run out of clever solutions, so they tried stupid instead. Turned out stupid was precisely what that situation needed." The deeper legacy of that June morning in 1944 manifested not in individual recognition, but in institutional learning. The incident became case study in multiple military academies, examining the relationship between tactical doctrine and adaptive problem-solving. It illustrated fundamental tension in military operations. Doctrine provides structure enabling coordinated action by large organizations, but rigid doctrine creates predictability that enemies exploit. The German sniper had been trained to anticipate conventional British tactics and had positioned himself to counter those tactics perfectly. Hendricks' slingshot circumvented that anticipation entirely because it existed outside the tactical framework both armies understood. Thomas Hendricks died on March 15, 1991, aged 68, from respiratory failure caused by combination of emphysema and decades of exposure to dock chemicals and cigarette smoke. His funeral was attended by 47 people, including family, former colleagues from the docks, and 3 surviving members of his wartime battalion. The eulogy, delivered by his eldest daughter Catherine, made no mention of combat heroics or military recognition. Instead, she described a man who approached every problem with same methodical determination, who maintained his tools meticulously, who understood that practical solutions often trumped elegant theory, and who carried psychological weight of war with quiet dignity that never sought attention or acclaim. The slingshot itself was never preserved. It was discarded after the operation, considered refuse rather than artifact. No photographs documented its construction. The only physical evidence of its existence consisted of official reports and witness testimony compiled decades later. But the impact remained measurable in lives saved, objectives achieved, and the demonstration that military innovation emerges not only from research laboratories and high-level strategic planning, but sometimes from desperate men with practical skills willing to propose solutions that sound completely absurd until they work. If this story of ingenuity under fire moved you, please subscribe to keep discovering the forgotten heroes whose improvisation and courage shaped history. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What other unconventional tactics should we explore? Hit the notification bell so you never miss these untold stories from the Second World War. Cheers, and thank you for watching.